So welcome everyone to our first of our webinars for the 24-25 season. I'm Lindsay Wallace. I'm, excuse me, the coordinator for the Great Plains Conservation Network. The Great Plains Conservation Network is an organization dedicated to thinking big and connecting all those other people who are thinking big. We know that the Great Plains is just a huge expanse, and everybody is sort of working away in their corner to work at rewilding and conserving these really important landscapes. And so through our webinars and our e-newsletters, we're trying to connect people and so that you guys can all see the work that others are doing. As well, we have our working groups who are working on a lot of times those big, large landscape level projects that cross boundaries. So today I'm really excited to welcome Henry Pollock, who is on our steering committee. He's also the chair of our bird working group, and he's also the executive director of the Southern Plains Land Trust and resident bird expert there. It's truly inspiring to see the work that the team at Split is doing to rewild their corner of the Great Plains. Henry holds a PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in ecology, evolution, and conservation biology, and has nearly 15 years of experience as a wildlife biologist and academic researcher. He's dedicated to gaining ground for prairie wildlife and continuing to expand the Southern Plains Land Trust reach through the Southern Plains to bring back the American Serengeti. Welcome, Henry.
All right, thanks a lot, Linz, for the introduction. Let me just share my screen really quickly. Let's see, here we go. Oh, and then I gotta share sound. They're all the Zoom headaches that we always have. Okay, can everybody see that okay?
Yeah.
All right,
Looks
awesome.
good.
Cool. Yeah. All right, well, thanks. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, sorry, Lindsay. Thanks for the introduction, everyone. It's great to be here. And as Lindsay mentioned, I work at the Southern Plains Land Trust, and I am the chair of the nascent GPCN bird working group. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is in the context of birds, but it is important to mention these keystone species that are such an important part of our Great Plains and contribute so much to bird diversity. So I'll start out quickly with a summary of grasslands, which we're all probably very familiar with. But as we know, the world's grasslands comprise a large chunk of the terrestrial land area on the face of the Earth. In fact, it's about 30 to 40%, depending on how you define a grassland. So these are a huge component of our terrestrial systems. They account for more than a third of all global carbon storage. They are also the home to tremendous amounts of biodiversity and some of the most biomass-rich environments in the world. So whether we're talking about the African Serengeti with its famed migrations of wildebeest and other ungulates, or the American Serengeti, which is where I work, or we have the American bison. These landscapes are incredibly important for biodiversity, and they also have a variety of other ecosystem services as well related to water filtration, purification, nutrient cycling, etc. So let's zoom into what we're going to be talking about for the rest of today, which is the Great Plains that we're all familiar with. And the Great Plains is a giant swath of grassland that kind of spans across central North America. It's more than 1,000,000 square miles, and depending on how you define grassland, it makes up between 20 to 30% of all of North America. So it's a huge chunk of our biomes, and it extends all the way from Canada to Mexico. Now, the Great Plains, as with many other grasslands, is shaped by a few key processes, particularly grazing and fire, or as many of us have probably heard the term pyrrhic herbivory, which is the combination of those two factors and how they influence diversity in grasslands. They're also shaped by drought as well. So, so you can see here, this is a historic range of the prairie, and you can see these three different color bands, each of which corresponds to tall grass, mixed grass, and short grass prairie, respectively. And you see that it sort of grades from tall grass to short grass as you go farther west in America, and that's primarily due to precipitation. So as you go farther west, you get drier systems, and you end up having shorter grass, which is why we have short grass prairie in Colorado, where I am based at the Southern Plains Land Trust. Just to give again, this is a very fast crash course on the Great Plains. So this is by no means a comprehensive history, but to put in context a bit of what has happened in the last 1 to 200 years, particularly in the late 1800s, the Great Plains was the epicenter of a variety of different processes that has drastically impacted its biodiversity and its overall extent as well. This included the displacement of many indigenous tribes who relied on the plains for sustenance, homesteading and westward expansion, particularly following the Civil War in the 1870s and onward, sod busting and the plowing, the Great Plow Up, as it's often called, of the Great Plains, which ultimately led to the Dust Bowl, overgrazing, the riparian deforestation, the list goes on. And these were times of great strife for wildlife and for the habitats of the Great Plains. And in particular, this culminated in the 1930s with the Dust Bowl that we're probably all familiar with. On the left here, you see a picture of Black Sunday, which happened on April 14th, 1935. And basically, this was sort of the most severe storm in the Dust Bowl, which resulted from the plow up of all of these tens of millions of acres of land on the Great Plains. And in particular, this was most severe on the southern plains. So you can see here on the right, this is sort of the epicenter of the Great Plains, of the Dust Bowl, pardon, on the Great Plains. And right, that little yellow square is where I live, which is in southeast Colorado in Bent County, so just south of Lamar. So this area was hit unbelievably hard by these by this disaster, probably the greatest environmental disaster in modern North American history. And in the aftermath, there were some positives and there were some negatives. The positives were the realization that we can no longer live like this and we have to protect our grasslands and particularly our soil. So it resulted in the formation of soil conservation districts, which still persist to this day. It also resulted in the formation of the national grasslands, which are fairly large portions of grassland that are remain an important resource in the American West. There were some negatives, however, including the widespread defaunation that I mentioned, which came along with impaired ecological function, as well as continued agriculture and overgrazing. So to kind of sum up how these impacts were played out in the Great Plains, what we saw was the loss of some critical processes and some critical species that were really important for generating the patterns of biodiversity that we see on the Great Plains. And in particular, the alteration of fire and the suppression of fire had huge negative impacts on prairie wildlife, as did the loss of keystones, which is going to be the focus of this talk. Overall, in addition to the loss of these processes, we actually have lost more than 50% of the Great Plains. So this is a map of the WWF Plowprint map, which is a pretty famous map in the grassland world. And it shows you the extent of how some of these grasslands have been parceled up for conversion to agriculture and a variety of other reasons, including development. You can see that a large swath of it has been lost already. And additionally, in addition to this enormous amount of habitat loss, only 2% of the grasslands, or about 2%, is under formal protection. So on the right, you see some examples of, some of the national grasslands. But again, a large proportion of the Great Plains is still under private ownership, and could continue to go further habitat loss based on some of these economic pressures that have been historically important. So how does this affect birds? Okay, so this is what you all came here to hear about, probably, is the impact of this on birds. And as many of us know, grassland birds in North America are not doing very well. In particular, they're the most rapidly declining guild of birds in North America. And you can see that in panel C here of this seminal paper by Rosenberg that came out now about 5 years ago that showed that birds are declining across North America, but in particular, grassland birds are getting hit the hardest. And there are some stats that you probably heard. 3 in 4 of many common bird species like meadowlarks have been lost since 1970. And overall, about more than 50% of the total population of grassland birds has been lost since 1970. So these are staggering numbers. And I should mention that these numbers are from the US, but if you look at Canada too, there was a recent State of Canada Birds report that came out that found very similar patterns. So pretty much across the board, grassland birds are getting hammered. We know a lot of this is due to the loss of their habitat, right? There's a lot of habitat that's being converted to cropland and being developed, and that's a huge part of the problem. But there's also an important role here for keystone species in generating this grassland bird diversity. And so that's going to be the focus of the rest of this talk. And just briefly, when you think about grazing, which is, as I mentioned, one of the key processes in grasslands around the world, birds prefer different levels of grazing. So on the bottom here, you can see it ranges from bare ground all the way to sort of a mixed shrub ecosystem with every sort of foreseeable different type of grass height in between. And you can see that birds have variable sort of tolerance of different heights of grass and variable preferences as well. And this is really important in dictating where birds are and how well they do on the grasslands. In addition, animals like beavers, which we'll talk about today, are really important for birds by being ecosystem engineers that alter their environment and create habitat for birds, in addition to the way that grazers do. And then species like prairie dogs, which in addition to grazing, they also create these enormous burrow systems, which provide habitat for a lot of species. They're very important prey for a lot of species. So again, this is going to be the focus of the talk for the rest of the day. And we're going to walk through each of these three different keystones, the bisons, the prairie dogs, and the beaver, and kind of talk about their historical population trends on the Great Plains, as well as what sort of the future holds for each of these species. So let's start with bison. Which was the main grazer on the Great Plains. And bison, at the height of their population, were estimated to be between about 30 to 60 million. Over time, these numbers have sort of gone down. So I've heard 60 million. I think 30 million is more accurate, but it's somewhat debated. But bison in these enormous numbers ranged across the Great Plains. They had an enormous distribution that ranged from basically, even Washington all the way to New York State, all the way across the U.S. in addition to the Great Plains. And they created habitat heterogeneity through their ecosystem engineering. So grazing heterogeneously across the plains, they're wallowing, they're rubbing on trees, etc. Their hooves create soil aeration, which allows for new plant recruitment and kind of maintaining grassland plant diversity. They disperse seeds both through their diet and also through their fur. Seeds get caught in their fur and get dispersed. Prevention of woody encroachment and the maintenance of grassland ecosystems by that rubbing that I mentioned. And again, these are just a few of the examples of why American bison are such an important keystone species on the Great Plains. In addition, they're a very important food source for humans and apex predators. So why do bison matter in particular for grassland birds? They're the largest terrestrial mammal in North America, and as I mentioned, that heterogeneous grazing that they create, that mosaic as they move across the plains and graze selectively, creates grass heterogeneity that benefits grassland birds. And again, this is just an example of some of the different types of grass that you see or habitats that you see in a grassland. And you can see that different birds have different preferences for different grass heights, and they will do better when they're in their preferred area. Just a couple other examples, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but a couple other ways that bison interact with birds and can benefit them is their fur is really important in bird nests. So both for thermoregulation as well as potentially for other reasons, birds are known to incorporate fur into their nests. Disturbance foraging, right? Many of us are familiar with birds like the brown-headed cowbird, which is a bird that isn't known to be a brood parasite. They actually lay their eggs in the nests of other bird species, and those birds evolved to follow bison around, which is part of the reason why they don't take care of their young, because bison were so itinerant and move around. So just a few of the examples of how bison impact grassland birds in particular. So now we're going to talk about the history of the bison in the last couple hundred years in North America. What happened to them? And this is going to be a common thread that we see among all of these keystones. As populations expanded westward and as technology expanded westward, we see the concomitant declines of a lot of these keystone species. Bison, and this is a map that I really like that shows how their range contracted in a very short period of time over the 1800s. Again, you can see that bison were in the southeast as recently as the late 1700s, as well as in places like New York and Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania. They contracted very rapidly following the expansion of railroads out west. So after the 1860s and the Civil War was over and people started thinking about moving west again, those railroads were vessels of destruction, and they brought with them tons of hunters, and that contributed to the speed of these declines of the bison. Additionally, at the end of the bison sort of, I guess, reign, the U.S. Army had an important role in, and that was intentional. They were intentionally trying to rob the Plains tribes of their food sovereignty to be able to subjugate them. So another great example of how these sort of social processes contributed to the ecological decline of the bison, and then of course advances in weaponry and the different types of guns and gun technology that came with the westward expansion were also very important in their decline. This is just a picture that shows, just a slice of some of the destruction that occurred. Just thousands of bison hides sitting there waiting to be shipped out east. In addition, habitat loss, including grassland conversion, as I mentioned, fire suppression, and the advent of barbed wire fencing in the 1870s, which essentially parceled up the West and made it really difficult for bison to make their typical natural movements, contributed to their declines, and the end result was near extinction. Bison went from an estimated, as I said, 30 million individuals to as it's estimated as few as 500 bison by the late 1800s. And there's a really nice video here that I'd like to share with you that kind of sums up in just 2 minutes how we went from tens of millions of bison to less than 1,000 in just a century. Take a look.
There may be no single image that better captures the timeless spirit of the Great Plains than this. A herd of bison on the move across the prairie. As many as 60 million of these majestic animals, also known as American buffalo, once blanketed the Great Plains. In fact, their range is believed to have stretched all the way from what's now eastern Washington to western New York State. For Plains Indians,
Whoop. Sorry about that.
Bison have long been sacred creatures, in part because of their remarkable size and impressive strength. But they have also been an important source of sustenance. The hunting prowess of these tribes enabled them to provide a staggering quantity of pelts to the European and American fur traders who arrived on the plains starting in the 1700s. In the 1830s, the American Fur Company shipped 25,000 robes made from bison fur out of the Great Plains each year. By 1848, the great slaughter of the American bison had begun. Over the coming decades, settlers, hunters, and others nearly wiped out this species. In the 1860s, one hunter earned his famous nickname, Buffalo Bill, after claiming to kill more than 4,200 bison at a rate of roughly 8 creatures a day. He was under contract to provide food for workers building the Kansas Pacific Railroad. When trains finally started running across the Great Plains, passengers often stuck their guns out of the windows and fired away on herds of bison as they passed, just for sport. By the end of the century, of the tens of millions of wild bison that covered the plains, only about 1,000 were left. Today, 5,000 descendants of those survivors live here at Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. It's one of a handful of conservation projects that are working to ensure that wild bison still have a place to roam on the Great Plains.
Alrighty, so a nice, just quick video that kind of summarizes the plight of bison in North America. And again, the video said 1,000. You hear different numbers, but I've heard it's fewer than even 500 individuals. So this was almost another great American tragedy, on par with other examples like the passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet, of a species that was just through sheer human greed and overconsumption and overhunting, almost went extinct. The recovery of the bison is a story that I could take hours to talk about, and I don't have that time today, but suffice it to say that it was a slow recovery that was thanks to a very eclectic group of a variety of people from different fields who came together to eventually saved the species from extinction. And this included people like William Temple Hornaday, who was the former director of the Bronx Zoo, New York, Teddy Roosevelt, the famous cattle rancher Molly and Charles Goodnight from the Texas Panhandle, and ecologists like George Bird Grinnell. And where we're at today is, again, it's been a long climb. So, we went from more than 30 million to just, less than 1,000 in a very short period of time. And then in the late 1880s is when people started to kind of kick in this kind of response. And where we're at now is, we now have hundreds of thousands of bison on the landscape in North America. So it has started to recover, but it's been a very slow recovery. I do quickly want to mention some of the benefits that have been shown in recent studies from reintroducing bison to different parts of the Great Plains. For grassland birds in particular, they generate higher abundances of a lot of grassland obligate species. Henslow sparrow is an eastern species, but you see the same patterns both in the eastern grasslands and the western. You see increased abundances of a lot of these grassland specialists in the presence of bison. Additionally, you see higher diversity. So this is a paper from a friend of mine, Andy Boyce, who works at the Smithsonian, and he works up in Montana on the northern plains. And they've shown that reintroducing bison to prairies in Montana increases bird diversity. So again, not only are you getting higher abundance, you're getting a more diverse bird community by reintroducing bison. There's been some studies actually showing that you have higher nesting success. So in this graph, you're looking at nesting success of a field sparrow, which is a grassland bird out east. And you can see here that bison are the triangles, and this is a time period looking at bison versus non-bison pastures. And you can see that in bison pastures, these birds across the board had higher nesting success in the presence of bison. So I don't have time to talk about all the mechanisms for this, but suffice it to say that bison can actually have demographic impacts in addition to abundance impacts as well. And then reduced brood parasitism is another thing that's really interesting. So I mentioned the cowbird, which used to follow bison around. Because they were so itinerant and moved around so much, there's actually been a couple of papers showing that they have less of an impact on the birds whose nests they parasitize with bison around, because they're forced to move around more than, for example, a sedentary livestock animal like cattle. So just a few of the examples of how in the last 10 or 20 years, bison reintroductions to places where they were previously extirpated from the Great Plains has benefited grassland birds. And in addition to the benefits on wildlife such as birds, I really quickly want to mention the importance for indigenous peoples. And so, there's all these ecological benefits, but there are cultural benefits as well that come with the reintroduction of bison. And in particular, on the northern plains that you see here, there's been some amazing efforts going on to reintroduce bison and study how that is impacting the birds. I mentioned that study by Boyce et al., but also to really reckon with some of the cultural benefits that come with bison reintroduction as well. So to wrap up on bison, where do we stand now? And this is a map that I really like, which is from Defenders of Wildlife. So it shows some of the reintroduction sites throughout North America, in this case, in the US in particular. And you can see that the overall population size is about 500,000 individuals. There's about 60 conservation herds, but only about 4% of those are of the bison that are currently in the landscape are managed like wildlife as opposed to being managed for production. So there's clearly a lot more work to do. And that, I forgot to mention, that's where we are in Southeast Colorado. So we have a little tiny dot in the map, but we're contributing in our own small way. And I quickly want to give a shout out to the GPCN Bison Working Group, which is currently led by Shammy Anderson of Defenders of Wildlife. These guys are doing some awesome work working across trilateral, really, Mexico, the US, Canada, to try to push the boundary on bison reintroduction and conservation, and start getting some of these cultural and ecological benefits that come along with them. So let's move to keystone species number 2. And this is the black-tailed prairie dog, this adorable little rodent that you see on the right here. And historically, and this is probably a conservative estimate, but their population has been estimated at least more than 5 billion individuals across the Great Plains historically. And this little bundle of joy right here provides a lot of ecosystem services. Similar to bison, they're ecosystem engineers, they're keystone grazers, but they create habitat, unlike bison with wallows, they create habitat with their burrows. So they create these large burrow systems where they burrow underground. that provides habitat for dozens of species ranging from amphibians to small mammals to birds. The list goes on. They aerate the soil and also can increase plant diversity. They have a very complicated vocalization system where they're actually talk to each other on their colonies to warn each other of predators. A lot of other species, including birds, benefit from that. And they're a very important food source for a variety of predators, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So another keystone of the Great Plains, and this diagram I really like, and it's not comprehensive, but it does show you some of the relationships that prairie dogs have with other species in the plains. So their prey, as I mentioned, for species like the black-footed ferret, which is the most critically endangered mammal in North America. They create these burrows which provide habitat for species like the burrowing owl. They clip and eat grass. They're herbivores, and that influences nitrogen cycling, forage quality. Bison really like to hang out on their colonies because there's new young shoots of grass growing. It impacts the habitat structure, which can impact species like the mountain plover. Again, the list goes on. They're one of the most important ecosystem engineers, I would say, in the world, if not at least in North America. And this is another nice picture which shows some of the species that associate with prairie dogs. So in terms of birds, dozens of species depend on them. We'll take a couple examples here using this diagram as inspiration. Breeding habitat, right? Where do these birds breed? Species like mountain plover that you see here on the left, they really like short clipped grass, and they're not obligates, but a large proportion of the population of mountain plovers, which are extremely threatened. There's fewer than 20,000 left in the wild. They breed on prairie dog colonies because they really like that short grass. It allows them to see predators coming, and they're highly dependent on the prairie dogs. Another great example are burrowing owls. So burrowing owls live and will often nest in and breed in prairie dog colonies. So they actually use unused holes or burrows underground, and they'll have their nest there. Another great example of a species that depends on the ecosystem engineering of prairie dogs for survival. In addition, they're prey for a lot of bird species, including raptors like ferruginous hawk. So ferruginous hawk is the largest buteo raptor in North America, and they are very partial to prairie dogs, and they often are not obligately, but very highly dependent on prairie dog colonies as well. So let's talk about what happened to the black-tailed prairie dog. And again, similar story to bison. A lot of this had to do with westward expansion of white settlers. And so as these settlers expanded, you saw similar declines. And for differently from bison, which were used more as a commodity, prairie dogs were viewed more as a nuisance. And for the last 150 years or more, they've been persecuted in the American West. The reasons why are that their burrows were seen as a danger to livestock. Maybe a horse or a cow will step in the burrow. They can compete with livestock for forage, especially under drought conditions. So it's and then crop damage and loss. If you're a farmer and you have prairie dogs eating your crops, you're not going to like that. And so what this resulted in was this kind of wide-scale persecution of prairie dogs across the American West. And this is still going on today. And as many of us know, these animals generate a lot of controversy despite the positive impacts that they have on grassland biodiversity. And then the second factor that really caused the precipitous declines of prairie dogs is sylvatic plague. So this was introduced around 1900 to the U.S. It's caused by the pathogen Yersinia pestis, which is the same pathogen that caused the Black Plague in Europe in the Middle Ages. And this was introduced to North America, and a lot of species here, small mammal species, were ecologically or evolutionarily naive to this disease. And so what has happened is that in addition to the persecution, stacked on top of that is now this plague, which can result in 90% mortality across a prairie dog colony during an epizootic outbreak. So these two factors have resulted in drastic declines across the range. And currently, black-tailed prairie dogs in particular occupy less than 2% of their previous geographic distribution and their former abundance. This is just a little map that I stole from our friends in the GPCN Prairie Dog Working Group that kind of shows the historical range and how that's contracted over the last 100 to 150 years. So what's the future of these on the Great Plains? And I'd like to just give a quick shout out to, again, the GPCN Prairie Dog Working Group, who has been working on this project. This has been a major team effort that I was not involved in, but I'm just kind of touting it. So they did this Homes on the Range project where they did a range-wide mapping effort to understand the current extent of black-tailed prairie dogs across the Great Plains, as well as trying to model future habitat suitability and climate change scenarios to understand how this species will expand or contract, and how they will be impacted by future land use and climate changes. So Anna Davidson and Lindsay Sterling Crank are leading this group, and they're working on kind of following up on this. But I think this is going to be, sort of the way forward with prairie dogs, is to identify priority landscapes for conservation, and then start working at a local scale with landowners and stakeholders to try to operationalize some of those goals. So lastly, today I'll tell you briefly about the beaver. And the beaver is another keystone species on the prairie. However, unlike being a grazer, like the prairie dog and the bison, the beaver is an aquatic species, as we all know. And their historical populations, as was estimated at 60 to even as high as 400 million beaver, which is really just almost staggering to hard to comprehend. And they provide a variety of ecosystem services across the board. They create wetlands. They raise the water table and improve water quality. They can mitigate the risk of floods. They increase biodiversity across taxa for arthropods, amphibians, birds, etc. And they actually help with climate change resilience as well as being a very important food source. So again, beavers are another species that historically was getting a lot of bang for their buck in terms of how they were impacting the rest of the grassland species and birds in particular around them. And when it comes to birds, it's important to mention that there aren't a lot of water birds that breed on the Great Plains, but there are a lot of species that migrate through, and there are a lot of species that depend on the water that's available in the Great Plains for survival. So a stat that I like to throw out there is that riparian habitat on, for example, the shortgrass prairie where we work is only about 2% of the overall land cover, but 80% of prairie species depend on riparian habitats to some degree or another for survival. So some of the benefits, and again, not an exhaustive list, but just to give you a brief overview, that beavers can provide to birds is enhancing nesting habitat. By bringing up that water table, it allows riparian vegetation to reestablish. Native willows, for example, really important habitat for species, for example, like the southwestern willow flycatcher, which is a locally endangered population in the Southwest. They increase arthropod food resources. So, as they get more water in the landscape, more primary productivity, everything else increases with it, and you get these more complex and more stable food webs. And as I mentioned, for waterfowl and species that don't breed there, it's still incredibly important during migration. When you're moving around, through a very arid landscape, from a bird's eye view up high, these small playas and riparian habitats in the prairie are disproportionately important for migrating water birds as well. So just a few examples of how having beaver on your landscape can really move the needle for grassland bird conservation. Oh, spot the bird there. That's a yellow-rumped warbler hanging out on a beaver dam. So what happened to the beaver on the Great Plains? And again, the story is the same as the bison and the prairie dog, so hopefully I'm not boring you. But it started a little bit earlier. So it actually started in the Pacific Northwest with the British in the 1700s. But as American expansion continued and into the 1800s, as with the bison and prairie dogs, things the rate of destruction just accelerated. And beaver, because they are constrained to the stream bed, and they move around through the water and all these different things. They're really easy comparatively to trap, and there's nowhere for them to go. So what that resulted in was a very efficient trapping out of beavers through a lot of the American West. And the international beaver trade is a super famous. There's some really good books on this, but basically what you're seeing here in the bottom right is the sort of Santa Fe Trail, and then you can see the trade routes that went either down the Mississippi to New Orleans or from St. Louis all the way back to New York City. These beaver pelts were internationally popular. They were getting shipped back by the thousands to London, even as far as Tokyo. So the international beaver trade was what drove the economic engine that drove a lot of this decline. In addition, if anyone's ever read any like Lewis and Clark or early pioneer books, you know that beaver were unbelievably abundant and were a primary food source for a lot of pioneers. In particular, for whatever reason, the tail was often seen as this major frontier delicacy. And one kind of example that I like to think about is Bent's Fort, which is right in my neck of the woods in southeast Colorado. This is the former ancestral lands of a lot of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho in particular. And Bent's old fort was founded by Charles Bent, who was a trader on the Santa Fe Trail. The fort was founded in 1833, and by 1840, in the span of 7 years, they had hunted out tens of thousands of beaver all the way across the entire region. Pretty much there were no beaver left. And there's some really kind of depressing quotes from people about, talking about how they came to areas that used to be teeming with beaver and found not a single beaver. And so the end result of this, as you can imagine, was near extirpation. Although, unlike the bison and prairie dogs, beaver have been recovering much more in recent decades. And although there's still a fraction of their former numbers, they've been doing a lot better and are incredibly resilient species. So what's the future of beaver on the Great Plains? Well, one example that kind of is a snapshot of where we're at right now, and this is for the state of Colorado, is the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool. So I encourage those of you who aren't familiar with this to check it out. It's a really fun tool to explore data on beaver, but you can see here on the Eastern Plains that there's some scattered beaver occurrences along some of the major tributaries like the Arkansas. But all of these smaller streams that used to be teeming with beaver on the southern Great Plains are just they're gone. And so there's a lot of work to do, and it's not an easy it's not an easy task, because some of these ecosystems have become the streams have become so in size that it's very challenging to try to bring them back to life. But this diagram is a great example of how across the American West people have been using innovative techniques like beaver dam analogs, which often encourages beaver to then colonize and continue bringing the benefits that they do. And they've seen changes in 1 to 3 years in many places where you have this unbelievably incised stream going to a much higher water table with less incision, more riparian vegetation, and just so much more biodiversity. And so, I think that the future of beaver conservation and how we get beaver back is we have to, it takes a lot. We're going to have all hands on deck, and we're going to have, just tons of small conservation projects that are going to eventually get them reestablished on some of these damaged waterways in the Southern Plains in particular. And then human wildlife conflict mitigation. So beaver can often bring problems, right? They can impact like water flows. They can cause flooding. So there's a lot, and I'm really excited about the future directions for mitigation possibilities to keep beavers in situ and just manage them so that you're making sure that they're not negatively impacting human livelihoods. So in summary, hopefully I've convinced you today that grasslands, particularly the Great Plains, are shaped by keystone species like the ones we see here, the American bison, the black-tailed prairie dog, and the American beaver. And all of these species have declined drastically in the past couple hundred years, and occupy a fraction of their former extent and abundance. And these have had negative impacts on grassland bird populations. So hopefully I have convinced you that ongoing restoration of keystones will be essential for grassland bird conservation, in addition to protecting the grass that we have left and trying to restore, what's been damaged. So thank you for attending. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Oh, great job.
Thank you.
It looks like Taylor has their hand up.
Go for it.
I think you're on mute still, Taylor.
Okay, gotcha. No question. It was an applause. Thank you, Taylor, for the applause. Oh yeah, Cliff, go ahead.
Yeah. So of those three species, which do you think are the most difficult to deal with culturally in the context of which they
Wow.
occur now?
Wow, that is yeah, that's I mean, I don't know. There's probably people in here who know a lot better than I do. I see David and Anna in here. I think that, bison I think there's a lot of recognition that bison are becoming more accepted. I mean, they're the national mammal, right? So I think that the animosity towards bison is not as great, even though they are, often viewed as competitive with cattle and stuff like that. Like I feel like there's a lot of momentum for bison, which I'm really excited about. I think beaver, I think there's momentum for that too. I think that, there, especially with there's so much riparian like good stuff happening, like the removal of dams in the Pacific Northwest, and I think that along with that, there's been a lot of grassroots efforts to get beaver reestablished. And I know Ben Goldfarb's book Eager has been really seminal in kind of bringing popular attention back to beaver. I mean, I read that and I was like, okay, like we got to get beaver back out here. So I think probably in my mind it's the prairie dogs. There's just in our region and my neighbors in southeast Colorado, like there's just so much hatred for prairie dogs, and it's something that that I just like I struggle with because I see species like meerkats which have their own show on TV and were like super popular and have so many similar traits, right? The sociality, they're just adorable, and I find it I think that is probably the hardest thing to push back on and what's going to require the most resources, I guess you could say.
Yes, we need Disney in here.
For sure. Disney Prairie Dog movie. I love it. That's a great idea.
Henry, this is Rob Gardner in Medicine Hat, Alberta. And thanks for the great program there. Great statistics. I think it's important to note that the beaver were exterminated by the trappers and not by the settlers or the modern ranchers. And so there's no need to point fingers at the ranchers, unlike perhaps the prairie dog situation or even the bison situation. I think
Great point.
the ranchers ought to appreciate the increased abundance of water on their rangeland, allowing a better distribution of their cattle. So we should be promoting the win-win situation there.
Absolutely. No, that's a really good point that you mentioned there. And Rob, and I think I didn't make that distinction, but Rob is right. Like a lot of again, the beaver started earlier. It started in the 1700s. And I think that, there was these because they were so easy to kind of target and trap, and because they were, constrained to be in these waterways, they were just kind of like easy picking. So that's a really good point. And I think I do think that there in our neighborhood, one of our neighbors reintroduced beaver in the last like couple years, and I think that I think there's more acceptance culturally for the benefits that they bring in terms of bringing more water. Where we're at, it's controversial. Like beaver, there's so many eyes on our region because it's so highly agricultural, and there with climate change, there's expected to be even less water, and I think that some people are skeptical because they think the beaver are going to slow down the water and prevent it from getting to the producers. And I do understand that, but I agree with you, Rob. I think that it can bring a lot of benefits to rangeland. So great point.
If I could continue, some ranchers tend to be on the conservative side politically and socially, I've noted. And I try to point out the renegade aspect of beaver, that they can capture water without a water license or permit.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah. Thanks, Rob.
I'll ask another one. So cattle domestic or bison domestic and wild bison. Do we need clearly staked out territories and rules, firewalls, or how do we deal with that?
I think right now I think I think when you compare a cow and a bison, and I didn't have time to do that here, but I think that the reality is that keeping land like rangeland in rangeland is really important, as we all know. And so I think that and I think that there's papers showing that in terms of birds, for example, like there's a paper by Andy Boyce showing that cattle and bison both have positive impacts on bird diversity when they're grazing land compared to a control. So I think that in terms of the bison, I think that they're a different animal from cattle. And I think that because of that, even if they're held in production, I think that some of their ecological function will be lost if they're held in small pastures. It's just the nature of how it works. They need large spaces to roam. But I do think, if you look at the way they graze and their effect on riparian areas in particular, I think bison in production is probably going to be a lot better for riparian areas than cattle in production. So I think that right now it should be all hands on deck approach. I don't think that having like a conservation herd per se is the only way to do things. And I think actually, it's a challenge, right? Like if you're managing them as wildlife, as we do at the Southern Plains Land Trust, at some point, we're going to have overpopulation because there's no natural predators and they're just such a hardy animal, right? So, 10, 15 years down the road in our organization, we're thinking about, well, how are we going to deal with, this increasing population? And, it's just the spaces they used to roam over were so immense that, I feel like there's no way you're going to be able to attain, that level of ecological function unless you do it in a piecemeal way. So.
Lindsay, did you
Lindsay,
have a
did you have a
question?
question?
Yeah, hi Henry.
Hey, Lindsay.
I get this argument in Boulder from one of the agriculture communities that prairie dogs are negatively contributing to carbon sequestration. And I've always understood that, based on all the ecosystem services they provide, I just didn't see how that was possible. It seems to me like they would contribute positively to sequestration. So
Yeah.
I always feel like the way that they nurture the soil and the plants, and I've kind of learned through the last several years through this shared learning collaborative that I'm in, that prairie dogs are really going to kind of grow or perpetuate whatever plants or seed bank they have, be it native or non-native. That's what we've been seeing out there. But I just wonder, I see beavers really making a comeback based on water recharging, and I'm wondering, how could we equate that to prairie dogs, or if you agree with me, or I know Anna and David have probably worked on this a little bit too, but how could we equate prairie dogs to, being a contributor to healthy soils?
Absolutely. And I think that, yeah. So, honestly, Anna can feel free to chime in. She probably knows better than me. But like, as far as I understand it, the best evidence out there is David's study from the Seeper in the Pawnee grassland in northern Colorado, where he's done long-term studies of forage consumption by prairie dogs and cattle. And, in heavy drought years that, prairie dogs do reduce the amount of forage available to cattle to a certain extent. But in normal years, it's not that big of a deal. And I think that, this idea, I think a lot of the way that people react to prairie dogs is aesthetic. I think it's a visual thing. If you go to a prairie dog colony, it looks overgrazed, right? Like it's the grass is clipped short, and if you're looking at it just with the naked eye, I think that sort of like visual representation is part of the reason why people are like every rancher that you talk to, Lindsay, and I'm sure you know this, like they'll be like, they hammer the grass, like they ruin the grass, you know what I mean? And so like I think that you have to, this is why the importance of data, right? Like you have to have studies like David's that show that, this whole thing about competition between prairie dogs and cattle is so overblown, you know what I mean? And a lot of it is based on these antiquated stats from like the 1800s, right? And I think that that's why, I always, as an empiricist, someone who has an ecological background, I always lean on data. And I think that thus far, the available data suggests to me that prairie dogs have a positive impact on soil aeration, on plant biodiversity. Why do all the livestock hang out on their, why are the cattle stepping in the prairie dog holes? Because they like that fresh new grass that they're selecting for, right? So that's I guess that's my thought on it. I think they do bring benefits, and I think that the data tells the story. So
Thank you.
Yeah, prairie dogs know how to grow yummy species.
indeed.
Good gardeners.
Hello, this is Erica. I just had a comment. I think it's also very important to look at that predator-prey balance, and predators are very important in the health of this whole system, and allowing predators to come back as well, so we have that balance. For example, the prairie dogs, right? The black-footed ferret was one example. There's swift fox, coyotes, even wolves that played a crucial role. And I think it's important to also start educating people about the importance of predators in this whole ecosystem. And the other thing, I just had a question about bubonic plague. I know it takes a huge toll on the prairie dogs, even in Grasslands National Park. Is there a way to control that?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, yeah, I think, I mean, the really, you know, the story of the predators is the other side of the coin of what we've talked about here today with the loss of keystones, right? Wolves, grizzly bears, coyotes, you name it. I mean, coyotes are, you know, they just are impossible to be beaten. They're just a champion, you know, species. But, you know, like there used to be 50,000, you know, grizzlies on the plains. There used to be 500,000 wolves on the plains. Wolves were more abundant on the plains than they were in mountain areas. And we think of them as a montane species, but those are the refugia that they were driven to by all their persecution. So 100% agree. You know, these are incomplete ecosystems, and you need to put back all the pieces of the puzzle eventually to be able to make them work. And, you know, I think there's obviously, you know, in terms of the social resistance against predators like that, you know, that's probably higher than maybe even prairie dogs, right? So I think that it's not going to be a challenge, but I think that, you know, I mean, wolves are just reintroduced in Colorado, et cetera. So I agree. In terms of the plague, my response to that would be that you have to constantly mitigate for plague. A great example is the Kanata Basin, which is the largest black-footed ferret recovery site in North America, which was hit by plague this summer. And Lindsay, Sterling Crank, and a variety of other people in the prairie dog world, it's like all hands on deck to get up there and try to like start treating for plague to prevent it from becoming this enormous, you know, 90% loss event. But the reality is that where we're at right now, you know, Anna Davidson is doing some really cool work on trying to understand the genetic basis of plague to understand if there could be like plague resistant prairie dogs, maybe. You know, I think that's really interesting. But right now, where we're at, if you want to have ferrets, if you want to protect prairie dogs, you have to mitigate for plague constantly. And so at Split, where I'm at, like you know, like we work with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, we work with a variety of other agencies. And, you know, we spend, you know, all told, like all together with like materials and labor, like, you know, we're spending like over $100,000 a year on various types of, you know, plague mitigation techniques. And I just think that is absolutely crucial in order to, you know, sustainably grow prairie dog acres and then obtain the benefits that come with those growing prairie dog acres. So
Thank you.
you're welcome. I think Eric has a question.
Yes, well, Southern Plains Land Trust has done really a great job at restoring bison and prairie dogs that I know of. I'm not sure where you're at with beavers, but it's really an amazing thing that your organization is doing, and I've seen you expanding your acreage recently. How is that working? How are you successful in getting GoCo funding for that and public funding? And how big can that be scaled up in terms of restoring a really large scale ecosystem such that you have bison with huge migrations again?
Yeah, you know, I think that great question. First of all, thanks, Eric. Great to meet you. I'm familiar with your work and I would love to chat with you at some point. But thanks for the kind words about Split. I can't take credit for I've only been at Split for a year. Nicole Rose Marino, who's a former executive director, and Jay Touchton, who is our current preserve manager, were like largely responsible for building our land portfolio, which now is over 60,000 acres. And the largest piece of that is Heartland, which is 43,000 acres and soon to be more than 50,000 acres of contiguous, you know, protected grassland. So, you know, I think that we in Colorado have benefited from the tax credit. So if you are really conserving land per se and you're devaluing it, but in Colorado you get a chunk of that money back as a one-time tax credit if you're going to protect it in perpetuity. So we've been able to leverage that a lot to make the cost of buying land effectively a lot cheaper in the long term. But you know, I think that you have to strive towards, you know, this is the reason why, you know, we have to work together as conservation organizations. It's part of the reason why GPCN, why I love GPCN, why I have been getting more involved with them, is because that landscape scale perspective and the realization that you have to work across agencies, across international boundaries even, to make this happen is going to be essential. And so I think that, you know, we need to build large contiguous areas, but we also need to be thinking constantly about connectivity and ways that we can work towards connecting those areas, making them functionally connected to allow some of these processes, these historical processes like bison migration and, you know, other ungulates like pronghorn migration and stuff to occur. And so, you know, there's a lot of work to be done, but I think that, you know, people like GPCN are the reason why I have hope, I guess you could say.
One last call for questions and then we'll wrap it up. All right. Well, thank you so much, Henry, for coming out and chatting with us today. Just a reminder that GPCN is funded by organizations who donate to us as well as individuals. So if you enjoyed today's presentation and think that the work that we're doing is important, I just dropped the link in the chat, and please go and throw a couple bucks our way if you can. Thanks again, Henry. That was really interesting, and thanks for everybody who joined us today.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Henry.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stay well.